Okay, welcome everyone. This is our eighth session in this last part of Master Shantideva's text on chapter 9. Let's go ahead and start with the prayers as usual, reciting the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha 3 times. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan. I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan. I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Let's go ahead and do the short mandala offering prayer in the English. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. Then finally, refuge in bodhicitta, once in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyen gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shog. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki Chanyan Gipe Sanam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Druparsho. All right, let's do a short meditation as we usually do, just to focus the mind a bit in the first few minutes, using the breath as your meditation object. And then I'll come in and lead you in a short reflection to set our bodhicitta motivation. So let's go ahead and get started. So now let's set our motivation for tonight. We can recall that all of this chapter pertains to developing this perfect wisdom that is essential, not just for attaining our own liberation, but especially for attaining enlightenment. Recall also that the Buddha said that without this wisdom, beings will continue to circle from life to life under the control of their karma and delusions, will not know freedom from suffering, but moreover, again, will not know complete enlightenment, the full development of their potential. But every being does have that potential, has the ability to transform their minds from this deluded state into the state of perfect Buddhahood. So we generate this motivation of bodhicitta with that knowledge and that awareness that we are dedicated to helping all beings to attaining that perfected state through developing our own realizations, our own ability to help them to realize emptiness and to accomplish that same goal. So just generate this mind of bodhicitta in your heart right now with that sincere wish that everything we do tonight becomes a cause, not for our own liberation, not even for our own enlightenment, but for the enlightenment of all beings. Okay. So we had a few questions, Sneh said, from the discussion. So let me take those first, just so we can say goodbye to that previous part and move on. What were the questions? Anyone gonna come forward? Richard?
You go, Sneh.
So this was when we were trying to answer the first question, Gendon. And
Okay.
one thing that confused us was in reading His Holiness's, practicing wisdom on page 153, because we were thinking about, okay, what are valid cognizers and what does that mean? And at the bottom of page 153, there is a sentence that says, so the Prasangika Madhyamika respond, yes, we agree, just as the cognition ascertaining emptiness is deceptive. And it was that part that confused me a lot, which is, I always thought that the cognition ascertaining emptiness is non-deceptive, like the one non-deceptive thing is realizing emptiness even inferentially. And so we were wondering, does this mean that the inferential understanding of emptiness is deceptive and only a direct realization of emptiness is not deceptive?
Yes.
And Richard, Philip, please, okay, jump in.
Short answer, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, this whole section was pertaining to inferential valid cognition. That there's always a deceptive appearance together with that. So we don't have the unadulterated, pure view of emptiness, realization of emptiness until it is direct, yogic direct perception on the path of seeing is the initial one. And then it continues through into Buddhahood. And of course, in Buddhahood, you're in that meditative equipoise on emptiness all the time, while you are also simultaneously realizing everything that exists conventionally.
So would it be correctly understood then to say, like, when we do the inferential meditations on emptiness, like the sevenfold reasoning and so forth, and even when we go over it and you come to the conclusion, yes, there is no essence, I can't find a substance, all of that inferential understanding is still deceptive because everything is still appearing to me as inherently existent, even though I know it's not. Is that what we're saying?
Correct.
Okay.
Because even for the Bodhisattva who's had that direct realization of emptiness, they come back out of meditative equipoise into what's called subsequent attainment. And everything once more appears to them as if it were inherently existent. They still have that false appearance. And again, that isn't gotten rid of until you attain Buddhahood, that element, due to the knowledge obscurations, the deeper obscurations that we have in our minds. So they have no conviction in it. And of course, as we meditate on it, even before we've attained a direct realization, we want to loosen our conviction that things exist in the way they appear. But we won't have a non-deceptive appearance of emptiness until it's in meditative equipoise.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. And Richard, do you have the other question?
I think it was basically what we were talking about at the end, when I was questioning the difference between an illusion and what we think of as truth. The issue of a child dying in a dream and a child dying is a difference. But I wonder whether or not it makes sense to spend time on it again now, because I know you have a lot to do, and I think there's even a course that could be taught on what the difference is there. And I'm sensitive to not going down rabbit holes.
Yeah.
Horned or unhorned.
Well, maybe what might be good is what is the sticky point for you, Richard, with regard to that, or what is it that is?
I think that the differences between the two are kind of finessed. A lot is made that that it is like an illusion to go through the world, in our day-to-day lives, and yet, like an illusion and being an illusion are things different, are two different states. And how is it like an illusion, and how is it not like an illusion? And that's really the question.
Yeah. And again, I think it's simply from the point of view of things having an appearance that is not in accord with how it actually exists. And of course, if we have an illusion occurring in some sort of magical illusion that somebody does, then the appearance of something being there, such as again these Indian magicians who would make horses and elephants appear, there's an appearance of a horse or an elephant, but there isn't the actual horse and elephant, there. And again, so we say that they're, we don't, I guess why we often tend to use this phrase of like an illusion or like a dream is because an illusion doesn't have any cred whatsoever. I mean, there's nothing credible about it, that you can actually point to, except that there's an appearance of a horse or an elephant. There's nothing there that again is speaking to that. Whereas we do, in the course, in our middle way point of view, say that there still are conventional phenomena, that things do appear, but the way that they come into existence isn't in any sort of concrete or inherent way. And that's how they actually appear to us. So that's the layer of illusion that's going on. We're not saying that things are illusions or are dreams, but nonetheless, I think, when you get to this point of peeling away all of our ignorance, things do have, again, a very, very subtle way of existing that I would think that, again, when we're getting into this section tonight, where we're talking about the effects of realizing emptiness and how it undermines so much of the way we operate in the world, the way that we are driven by desire, the way that we have attachment for others and what have you. And so all of that is undermined by the force of our wisdom realizing emptiness. So the way that the I exists, or the way that anything exists, is really, really quite subtle. And I think it's kind of hard to, we tend to use those words like dreamlike or illusory simply because we don't want to fall into that nihilistic bent. But at the same time, I think when you get that realization, there's going to be not so much to grasp at in terms of reality. Reality is really, just very, very minimally existent, just nominally existent. So I don't know. I don't know if that helps, but again, I'm just speaking from what I project onto that realization, but I don't know for sure, obviously, So. Does that?
It helps, but I think it's really it's a longer kind of exploration that I think that I'm looking for, and I think I really, you know, I really don't want to spend time
Okay.
now, but maybe,
Okay.
I'll just keep on looking in my spare
Yeah.
time.
I haven't read all of Jan Westerhoff's book, but he tends to take these sutra examples that are set
The 12
out, and
illusions.
yeah, and then he kind of brings them into a modern context to explain what science knows about these various things and what have you. And it's kind of interesting, but I don't know if it's really what you're looking for either in terms of getting at that finer point of why it's illusion-like versus an illusion, or a dream-like versus a dream. But again, I think it's really driven by this thing that we don't want to go to a place where we say that it is just a dream, because then the consequences of our actions and so on get negated. And those all they are upheld within the sphere of emptiness, obviously, but they aren't existing in the way that they appear either. They don't have that kind of concreteness to them, and we're projecting that onto them. So I don't know. Anyway, I'm
So
not sure that if,
it's an interesting question,
yeah.
and I'll definitely,
Oh,
I hope you're getting 10% royalties on selling Jan Westerhoff's books, because I'm going to go get one.
no royalties involved. Let's go forward into the new material then. So what we're going to do tonight, I did want to start with just sharing. I was a bit stymied by that one last two lines that we went through, that I don't want to go again down another rabbit hole with that, but I think I was just maybe trying to find some deeper meaning in there. But this was again this is where we're at. We're explaining selflessness of phenomena in the last bits of that. Last few verses of that, stating the reasons. Let's see, this is 116, stating the reasons that establish the lack of true existence. And this is where we went into the Vajra sliver reason. Then we were in the final one, which is the reason of refuting generation and cessation of existence and non-existence. And within that, there was this last verse of that section, which is called refuting inherent generation upon establishing the reason. And this verse in particular, these two lines, where I was like kind of taken off track by this idea of an entity also does not become a non-entity, because it follows it would be two natures. I think that the gist of it is that because we're talking about inherent existence, which has always been one of the caveats that we have to throw out on occasion, then something that is an inherently existent entity cannot become a non-entity, because its inherent existence makes it something that is static and unchanging and incapable of going out of existence. So if you say that it becomes a non-entity, then it would have both the nature of being an entity and a non-entity. But it's also hypothetical that it becomes kind of a strange argument. I don't know. And where I got some of that from is I actually did find this one passage in Minya Kunsang Sonam's Brilliant Torch, which I had read through, but it didn't really speak to me in the way that and maybe it did afterwards. He says, next we shall prove that an inherently existent thing cannot become nothing or no thing, can't go out of existence as that inherently existent thing. Just as a nothing cannot become a something, you can't get something arising from nothing, so also an inherently existent thing cannot become a non-existent thing, because if it could, there would follow the unwanted consequence of two natures existing on one ground, which was half existent and half non-existent. So again, I think all that he's saying is essentially that if you do have inherent existence, anything that is inherently existent that you're positing existing can't also be non-existent, because if it's got a non-existent feature to it in the midst of its inherent existence, then you have two natures. And those two natures abiding together, of course, are contrary, they're contradictory. Because how can something be existent and non-existent at the same time? So anyway, I don't know. That's my deeper, or if it's any deeper understanding, it's my subsequent understanding, let's put it that way, on that verse that I just thought I would share with you. So let's go on to the next section. We only have two verses left in this. We have, I'm sorry, we did have a little bit of the commentary that I didn't go through in regard to that same verse. This is the very bottom of page 74 of Gyaltsab Je, where he says, take the subject, sprout. It is not generated inherently, because it is not inherently generated as existent, and it is not inherently generated as non-existent. Because again, this is the whole premise of this type of argument, this reasoning, is that there can't be something that is inherently existent or inherently non-existent. I mean, it's kind of a follow-up to the production, that things can't be produced inherently, but we're talking here mostly about, in this reasoning, the mode of existence or non-existence. And then it says, for example, like the child of a barren woman. And again, that's an example of a non-existent that is saying essentially that, neither of those can possibly exist, those options. Goes on to say, although its generation is refuted, if non-existent at the time of the cause, it is a refutation of its inherent generation at the time of generation, even though it is non-existent at the time of the cause. This is just reiterating what we saw last week, that when we start talking about something being produced, which was being referred to in some of those verses, we can't talk about the mere non-existence of sprout at the time of seed, because everyone agrees that the sprout doesn't exist at the time of seed, right? You have the seed, and the seed's existence hasn't yet transformed or kind of gone non-existent as it transforms into the sprout. So we can say that there is the non-existence of the sprout at the time of the seed. Conventionally, that's not a problem. And in a sense of dependent arising and things existing through mere imputation, no problem. But when we get to inherently existent, that's where the problem lies. And that's all that's reiterating, is that we have to say that its generation has to be qualified as being inherent. That's why the last sentence is, therefore, one needs to relate it to the object of negation, which is the inherently existent generation or existence or whatever we're talking about. Again, that's what we're trying to disprove. We're never disproving mere production or mere existence or mere non-existence. All these things exist and are things that we can posit through conventional valid cognition. What we're refuting is the overlay of inherent production or inherent generation. Okay, so now we go on to the next outline, which is on page 75. Refuting this refutes inherent existence. So let's look at the verse. This is number 149. In that case, there is no cessation, meaning, of course, inherent cessation, because we already looked at inherent production, inherent existence. There's not even any inherent cessation of things. And also, entities do not exist inherently. Therefore, all these migrating beings are always not produced and not ceased. We're kind of moving into, because the next part of it is going to take us into an exploration of beings, and we're especially going to look at generating great compassion for these beings. We can say that these migrating beings are not produced inherently. They don't cease inherently, because no such inherent existence can be found. So again, this is one where we do have to do the same sort of qualification in regard to that verse. We can't simply say, that, oh, there's no cessation at all, or, entities do not exist. These are not valid statements. We have to always qualify it with inherently. So let's look at what Gyaltsabje says on page 75. He says, if we look at the non-inherent existence of generation due to the reasoning explained above, because the negation does not exist inherently, and then the negation or the cessation of something does not exist inherently, and because functionalities, things, do not exist inherently, all these migrators are never inherently generated or inherently cease. They are primordially pacified and naturally liberated. This phrase, naturally liberated, is referring to the same thing we saw earlier in this text, natural nirvana. Natural nirvana isn't the nirvana that we talk about, that's the state of cessation of all of our obscurations and what have you, afflictive obscurations, and then non-abiding nirvana, which is Buddhahood, is also the removal of all the knowledge obscurations. That's not the nirvana that's being referred to here. Natural nirvana is the natural non-existence of inherent existence with regard to everything, the natural emptiness. So it's a nominal division of nirvana, because it's not technically a actual nirvana. It is simply referring to the fact that everything, as is said here, is primordially pacified. There's never been an atom of inherent existence, even though we, all sentient beings, have believed in that, adhered to that, have great conviction in that. Okay, so let's go back to the slides. I do have a slide I want to share from His Holiness. His Holiness, in Practicing Wisdom, says, having thus negated intrinsic origination and cessation, the conclusion arrived at is that processes such as origination and cessation can be understood only in terms of mere conditionality. And we got into this, talking about this a little bit last week and the week before, when we were talking about how dependence upon causes and conditions proves that things lack inherent existence. Because just the fact that things have conditions, have causes that bring about their arisal, they're produced through that, they can't exist inherently then, because inherent existence would require that they set themselves up, that they are able to establish themselves, that they exist from their own side. Any level of dependence upon causes and conditions, parts, and then of course the subtlest, dependence upon mere imputation, all of these belie any inherent existence. So His Holiness is just putting that in there as kind of a statement around that time of these verses to show how we're essentially proving that, that things do not exist inherently simply by on the basis of their conditionality. And that's the only way they can be understood, as dependent arisings that arise in dependence upon their causes and conditions. Now we go on to the very last verse of this section. Then establishing the equanimity of samsara and nirvana, that these two states in their ultimate nature are not different at all. While obviously in their conventional nature, they're quite different. The state of being in samsara that we're all experiencing is very different from the state of nirvana. But in their final nature, they are not different. The first two lines of verse 50. Migrating beings are like a dream then. When analyzed, they resemble a plantain tree. A plantain tree is often used as another example of kind of something that is essenceless, because it's essentially all these leaves that make up the root of like a banana tree or a plantain tree, not the root, the branch, or what's it called, the the trunk of a tree, because it's more of a bush even. But I think we even had this example earlier. But a plantain tree it doesn't have any sort of fundamental core to it. You can't like keep peeling away things and get to something that is the final essence of it. And that's the same with regard to beings when they are analyzed, or any object when it's analyzed, that they're like a dream or like a plantain tree. So let's go to Gyaltsabje's commentary on this, the first paragraph there on middle of page 75. The dreamlike migrators of existence have not the slightest nature, and they abide individually without action and activity mixing. In other words, that there's no, and that things are arising on the basis of these various causes and conditions, and you don't see any sort of oh, that's kind of a weird phrase, without action activity mix. I think I had another translation of that I thought about using. Let's go on with the rest of it and see if it's clearer after that. When analyzed with the reasoning investigating suchness, they are like a banana tree. They appear as if there is something identifiable, but there is not the slightest inherent essence or existence. So again, action and activity mixing. I'm not sure what that phrase means, but the idea is again that you have an action, that a being is engaging in, and I don't know. I'm just speculating on this now. Let me see what maybe Stephen Batchelor says something different in regard to this. No, yeah. See, that's a weird phrase. I'm not sure why that's in there. Let's just skip over it. I don't want to chew on these phrases that I don't know for sure what that's referring to. But the idea is that, again, things, sentient beings are like a dream, are like something that is arising with a different type of appearance than the mode that they actually exist in. Let's go on to the next two lines, the last two lines of verse 150 that concludes this section. Also, having passed and not having passed beyond sorrow are not different in thusness. Okay, having passed beyond sorrow is nirvana. Not having passed beyond sorrow is samsara. That these two states are not different in thusness. They're different conventionally, because one is, the complete removal of all of the afflictive obscurations, and the other is the still being under the control of all of those. So they're very different conventionally, but they don't have any difference in thusness. This word, the station, I'm replacing it with criterion. I don't know why he chose that as a word here, the criterion that decides whether it becomes an analysis into suchness or not. If one is not satisfied with mere imputation by name and analyzes on the basis of wanting to investigate how the basis exists, whatever it is that we are analyzing, the person, other phenomena, then it becomes an analysis into suchness. So if we're not satisfied with things on the mere surface, and we want to really investigate, well, how does it exist in a more ultimate way? What is its final mode of existence? Then it's an analysis into suchness. But if one is satisfied with mere imputation by name and investigates whether Devadatta comes and goes, then it's simply a nominal analysis, right? If we just are talking about, well, where are my keys? Well, your keys are on the table. We're not getting at how do the keys ultimately exist. Anything that is simply accepting things in terms of what they are named and not looking for anything beyond that, any deeper mode of existence. That's just simply conventional existence. It's actually interesting. Lama Zopa Rinpoche in some of the retreats that I've attended with him has talked about how you can do an investigation into whether the merely imputed keys or merely imputed I exist, and you don't find them either. But that's not an investigation into emptiness. Why? Because you're not looking for the inherently existent I or the inherently existent key. So again, you have to use this overlay, this object of negation, as what you are trying to disprove. Because it's true, the merely imputed I can't be found either, right? Because it's merely imputed. It's just a nominal label of I that we're giving to this collection of stuff. But that's not the point. We're not trying to find that because that's by definition unfindable. There's no, nothing that is it because it is merely a label that is given to this collection of stuff. So again, we have to, acknowledge what is a real investigation into suchness. It's where we're not satisfied again with things existing merely through imputation, and we're looking for the deeper mode of existence, which of course is also to try to find that object of negation so we can refute it once and for all. So then he goes on to say, there is no difference in suchness between those gone beyond sorrow, free from the bonds that bind them to existence, such as attachment, and those not gone beyond sorrow that are caught in the prison of psychic existence. So you have two different classes of beings with two different states, those beings who are in the state of nirvana, those who are in the state of samsara, and they are the same in essentially. Why? Because both existence and peace are the same in being empty of inherent existence. At the deeper level, they are the same. Again, because as was said in that previous commentary, everything is primordially pure. There's nothing that has any inherent existence whatsoever. So at that level of existence, whether you're talking about a person in samsara or a being who has attained the level of an arhat in the state of nirvana, there's no difference between them when it comes to that deeper nature. The difference is only in terms of what they have or haven't done. Those that have gone beyond sorrow versus those that haven't. And it says from the King of Concentration Sutra, the Samadhi Raja Sutra, I think is what it's called. The dreamlike migrators of psychic existence, they are not born, and neither do they die. Of course, this means inherently. I always have to, with the Buddha Sutras in particular, though even here in some of these verses of Shantideva, you have to qualify what is being said here. These dreamlike migrators don't inherently get born, and they don't inherently die. And then from the sutra requested by the superior Upali, if one has comprehended the nature of phenomena, then all results are non-existent, and there is also no result to be attained. Again, in regard to their ultimate nature. The results of attaining nirvana or Buddhahood or whatever don't exist in that ultimate way. Their final mode of existence is emptiness, lacking any inherent existence. So that concludes that whole really, really long section. We're going now into the third point, which is on page 77, which actually goes back to the previous course, way back on the very first page of the outline, the Gyaltsab Je, when he started going into the main parts of this. So let's go ahead and pull that up on the screen so we can see where we're at in terms of the outlines. We're getting into the third of the three. We had that very first one that was just that single verse. Then we just finished this huge section that we've been in for a while about how we generate the wisdom realizing suchness. Now we're getting this wonderful advice from Shantideva that it is suitable to strive in realizing emptiness. This is kind of a really nice little pep talk from Shantideva and gives us a lot of points to chew on and to think about in terms of our own need to put a lot of effort into realizing emptiness. And His Holiness, in introducing this, he says, Shantideva now concludes the wisdom chapter by describing the benefits of contemplating emptiness. He says that understanding emptiness will firstly ensure that we do not become enslaved by mundane concerns. In fact, we will be able to trample upon worldly conventions, because if we really get emptiness at the deeper level, then we see that all this stuff that we're involved in, we're giving it more substance than it actually has. And we see that it doesn't have that existence whatsoever. So we don't get so caught up in all of our mundane concerns and preoccupations with the world that's been created through the force of our ignorance. Secondly, we enhance our potential for compassion by training our mind in this wisdom. Shantideva lists these as the two principal benefits of meditating on emptiness. And to some degree, we're going to see when we go through this that there are a lot of references to how sentient beings, when we start talking about the compassion for them, that they're under the control of this ignorance. And this is actually an allusion to the three types of compassion that Master Chandrakirti had in his text, the Supplement to the Middle Way. When he talks about great compassion, again, being not just the compassion that wants others to not suffer, but the kind of taking that agency on and saying, I will be the one to protect them from that suffering. So if we want to cultivate that mind to the greatest degree, we have three levels that we can do that at. The first is simply to observe sentient beings in terms of their suffering, which is how we normally talk about compassion, right? We focus on all the sufferings that these beings have to go through. And that's very powerful in and of itself. The second one is where we qualify them by their impermanence, because most sentient beings are clinging to the opposite. They think that there's something unchanging here, and they hold on to things as if they're going to last forever, including that life. That whatever life they have, they don't think it's going to end, and they want it to continue, and they want everything to have this sort of permanent quality. So when we do that, when we think about having compassion for beings who are impermanent, we're not just thinking about that is their state, but also how they cling to the opposite. They want things to be permanent and unchanging. And we get to the third. The third sometimes is called compassion observing the unobservable or the unapprehendable, which means inherent existence. You cannot find any inherent existence in regard to any of these sentient beings. They don't exist that way at all. But once more, just like we did with the second one, they believe in the opposite. They adhere to themselves as inherently existent, even though that isn't how they exist at all. So they are caught up in all of this suffering through the force of this big fat lie that they are agreeing to, that they are assenting to. So that's the level of compassion that is said to be the most effective, and that's what we're really driving at with Shantideva's verses here that pertain to developing compassion for others. When we see that sentient beings lack even an atom of inherent existence through our own investigation into emptiness, and then understand that they're clinging to the opposite, just like, of course, our own ignorance does or has been or whatever. And when we get to that place where we really truly understand emptiness, our compassion for others will grow even greater, because it's infused with the wisdom, understanding that they don't have to suffer. They are just clinging to something that is false, clinging to something that doesn't exist in the least. So this is the idea behind what His Holiness is saying about these last verses from Shantideva. So now we get into first the actual advice, and this has a couple of sections within it showing the meaning of the mode of abiding, and then it is suitable to strive in realizing that. So let's go on to the verses pertaining to this first section. With respect to entities that are empty in that way, through again, having done this investigation, what attainment is there? What loss is there? Who is honored or despised by whom? It's kind of interesting. We're already getting some references to what are frequently called the 8 worldly dharmas, where we're attached to gaining things, having that material gain, attaining things. And then we have an attachment to not losing things, not having loss. We like to be praised or have honor, given to us. And then we don't want to be despised or have criticism, what have you. So these are already some references to what we've seen previously in this course, the 8 worldly dharmas, which are our mundane concerns, which of course, if we are able to realize emptiness, then we recognize that all these things that we've been caught up in, that it's all really an illusion, like an illusion, I guess we should say, that we've been, imbuing things with all of that existence that isn't how they exist at all. And of course, it's driven by the adherence to the I as inherently existent. And then we infuse that on not just ourselves, but all phenomena. But this is, if we see emptiness through the reasonings that we've done, then that begins to loosen this already. So the first few lines of this rather large paragraph pertain to this verse. It says, if one comprehends, this is page 77, if one comprehends the actual nature of functionalities that are thus empty of inherent existence in the way explained earlier, when we went through these reasonings, then which gain does one attain and become attached to? Through the loss of what gain does one generate anger? Of course, these are what we get involved in these worldly concerns. We really want what brings us pleasure, and we don't want what will bring us pain or discomfort. And so this is the poles that we are vacillating between throughout our days generally. We get quite attached to everything going our way and being wonderful and getting the praise we want and so on. And we don't like to hear or experience the opposite. And he says, what is the benefit received by praise? And what is the harm received by criticism? And by whom? Who is the being that's receiving that? And I think these are interesting verses because once more, they're getting at that measure of if your realization of emptiness, even conceptually, is effective, it means that it's beginning to lessen some of that hold to all of that idea that we are sort of setting up this target of an inherently existent I that is so sensitive to all these things, it needs everything to be our way and doesn't want things to be the way that, when they're unpleasant and what have you. Everything is driven by that ignorance. And if we're beginning to make those questions and have, recognize that the answers to those questions are, there isn't anyone substantially that is experiencing that or that, is craving for that or whatever, then we begin to loosen all of that and we don't have such strong emotions. We don't vacillate, between these poles of attachment and anger and what have you. The next verse, where does happiness or suffering come from? What is there to be displeased about? What is there to be pleased about? When searched for in thusness, what craves and what does it crave for? No matter what we investigate, we find that things don't have any inherent existence. There's no inherently existent happiness, no inherently existent suffering, all of these things. So let's look at what Gyaltsab Je says here. He kind of continues in the same vein. He says, from what true cause does the suffering or happiness, it should say or happiness, it says suffering of happiness, but from what true cause does the suffering or happiness for which one engages into effort to attain and abandon it arise? What is the inherent object of aversion and desire that one dislikes and likes? If one investigates suchness with the reasoning investigating the nature of the mode of abiding, then which craving person generates craving for which object in dependence on which basis is craving generated? The 3 circles are often called the 3 spheres of craving lack inherent existence. When we talk about the 3 spheres, that's where we relate emptiness to the person and the actions and the object of those actions. So when we talk about craving, we talk about the person who's craving, me, the craving itself, which is the act of desiring something, wanting something, and the object of that craving, that beautiful, delicious, whatever thing, that we're craving at that time. But we see that all 3 of those spheres, the agent, the action, and the object, all of these lack any inherent existence. There's nothing inherently involved in any of them. We have come across these before. I just wanted to point that out again, what's often called here the 3 spheres. Let's go to the final verse of this section that is all about kind of taking this reasoning that we've been through and applying it to our situation. Upon analyzing, what is this transitory support of the living that will die here? Who will arise and who has arisen? Who is a companion? Also, who is a friend? And we can apply the same sort of logic to looking at any of these things. This transitory support, the body and so on of the living that will end up dying here. Is there any inherently existent body, any inherently existent death, any inherently existent person who arises, who has arisen? And what is a companion, a friend? You know, we put all these labels on things and we hold so tightly to them, but they don't have any inherent existence at all. So then it says, continuing with that commentary, we're about, 7 verses or 7 lines from the bottom of that paragraph. If one analyzes thus a result, if one analyzes karma and the person accumulating karma, then because death is empty of inherent existence, how can this worldly sentient being die here in existence? How? In other words, there's no inherently existent being who dies. Death doesn't have any inherent existence to it. Even the process of death would fly in the face of inherent existence because it is the transformation, change that is occurring on the basis of various factors. Goes on to say, how can it arise in a later life? How could it have arisen in a previous life? As there is not even the slightest inherent existence in the slightest. I don't know if that's intentional or not. I don't have the Tibetan, so I can't tell. But who is the benefiting relative or the attractive friend? Therefore, having worked at comprehending the meaning of the mode of abiding, one should train in equanimity for the 8 worldly dharmas, which were mentioned again earlier. 8 worldly dharmas or 8 worldly concerns. This is the kind of the best example of how we are getting caught up in things. We believe in this inherently existent I. It craves these things and it craves to be separated from, the unpleasant things. And that mode of abiding, of just kind of continuing to be caught up in this, is totally destroyed by the ultimate mode of, the mode of abiding that is the emptiness of inherent existence, the suchness of things, that things don't have any inherent existence at all. And if we really get that, if we get it at a really deep level, then it will undermine so much of our habitual craving that we have in our lives that is part of these 8 worldly concerns. Just to review them really briefly, you have them in 4 pairs. The first pair is, as I said, gain and loss, and then praise and criticism are another pair. Comfort and discomfort is often that third one is labeled as, and then good reputation and ill repute, bad reputation. These are the things that, again, we crave to have and crave to be separated from their opposite when they don't happen, when we have loss instead of gain, for example. Then we get 2 more lines. It is suitable to strive in realizing that. May those who are like me apprehend all as being like space. So one author points out that commentator says that this is Shantideva saying this again. He's being very humble here. He's saying, may those who are like him, obviously his knowledge and his realization, is much, much greater than certainly mine. But, when he's saying that may those who are like him and not having realized emptiness yet, may they apprehend everything as being like space. Now, this phrase like space, I decided to use Brilliant Torch commentary for this because he explains it, which I could explain it as well, but I thought it'd be interesting to, have his words. Minyak Konsang Sonam says, thus Shantideva, the author of this text, instructs his followers that people like himself should consider all phenomena as being the same, like space, for it is this path for realizing emptiness which cuts the root of existence and is the principal cause for attaining liberation and the state of omniscience, Buddhahood. When he says that things have the character of space, he means that just as space, which is defined as the absence of obstructing contact, it means essentially that space is a negation. It is negating that there is contact, and that's why things can abide within space, because there's no obstructing contact. So it's a negation, just as space is that negation. The true nature of all phenomena is a negation. It's them being devoid of inherent existence, the object of our refutation. So that's the idea behind this, is that, again, we are, Shantideva saying, may we all realize that things lack inherent existence, that they are like space and having a negative quality to them, negating that inherent existence. And he says this demonstrates the need to train in bringing together appearance and emptiness, which allows us to validly establish functioning things on the relative level without having to posit them as being totally empty. Now, this is how it was written in the commentary, but I think what they mean is when they say totally empty, they mean even empty of mere existence, because once more, that's the other trap that we fall into. Is that we would annihilate these things as existing at all if we think they don't inherently exist. So we can establish that they exist on a relative level without, falling into that extreme of them not being existent at all, being totally empty, as this author is saying. Because obviously they are empty, they have emptiness of inherent existence, but that doesn't negate their mere existence. All right, now we go into the next section, showing the object of great compassion by showing the disadvantages of cyclic existence. This is where we're going to get into that section I mentioned earlier, where we see, how we ourselves, and of course other sentient beings by extension, are dealing with all the various things of samsara on the basis of that ignorance, that is adhering to things existing contrary to how they exist in suchness and emptiness. This has 5 sections to it, none of them really that long, but nonetheless, we'll go into each of these. The disadvantages of this life. So we're first going to talk about that, then we're going to talk about the next life, and then we're going to go to some of the other difficulties that we and other beings create on the basis of this ignorance. Those who desire happiness themselves by means of the causes of conflict and delight are agitated and joyful. They live with great difficulty through sorrow, struggles, disputes, cutting and stabbing each other, and negativities. This is kind of pointing out that, in this life, through the force of ignorance, sentient beings get involved in all kinds of mayhem, through their desire to have happiness, their desire to avoid pain and difficulty. They get into struggles with others, conflict with others, engage in negative actions towards others, wounding others, harming others, yelling at others, and so many things that we do through the force of our ignorance. So let's go through Gyaltsabje's commentary on page 78. Even in this life, those desiring happiness for themselves are not beyond the power of suffering. Out of the wish for happiness, they fight with enemies and like their friends. And through these causes, they are either very disturbed or joyful. So we get very disturbed when we have the difficult people in our lives who challenge us because we are adhering so strongly to that concrete sense of I that is offended at that time. And then we get really joyful about having all the delicious, delightful things in our lives, and especially the people in our lives who really support us and are friends to us and what have you. So the enemies and friends take on a whole different flavor when we are driven by this inherently existent I, because that's what causes us to have the attachment and the conflict and whatever. It says they are miserable when not achieving their aim. If we are thwarted in trying to get what we want, look at how it results in so many negative actions. It appears as if they have to lead a very difficult life with much exertion, and yet attain little fruit due to the effort exerted to achieve the aim of their desires, due to arguing with others, cutting and stabbing each other's bodies, and accumulating infinite negativities of speech, mind, and so forth. Therefore, the wise one should not crave for the perfections of this life. In fact, it's kind of interesting. One quote, I don't know where this quote comes from. I think, I can't remember where I read this. It was in one of the teacher's transcripts from Discovering Buddhism, where, and you probably have heard this before, but because I'm kind of paraphrasing, but the idea is that if there's some sort of statement that if we had put all of the effort that we put into all of our worldly desires into the path to enlightenment, we would have been enlightened a long, long time ago. So all these sentient beings, that little phrase there, they due to the effort exerted to achieve the aim of their desires. Remember, we even way back in the first chapter, we saw that verse about how sentient beings, although they desire happiness, they run away from the causes of it. And although they desire to avoid suffering, they run right towards the causes of suffering. Well, this is what beings are doing through the force of their ignorance. They're totally caught up in things in the wrong way. And that's why we can say that once more, the starting point for all the Buddha's teachings is the desire to be happy and to not suffer. And the Buddha didn't fault that at all. That's what drives the whole show. The problem is, how do you get that? And the effort we put into getting happiness and avoiding suffering only creates the opposite effect. Happiness goes out of our reach and we end up experiencing more suffering. And we really have to get that. It's something well worth meditating on, to try to break through this ignorance that we have that just keeps clinging to the things of this life and thinks that we're somehow going to be happier if we keep holding on to all of that through the force of our ignorance, when in fact we just create more attachment, more difficulties and problems, more conflict, and so on. The next one, even if we just talk about the disadvantages of this life, we can certainly also project to the disadvantages that will ensue in the next life. So first, verse 156, after repeatedly going to the good migrations and enjoying much happiness, which obviously there is in those states, that's why they're called the upper rebirths or good migrations, they die and fall into the sufferings of the bad migrations, the lower realms, which are unbearable for a long time. This is the nature of samsara, is that there's no guarantee. You think you have this wonderful state of existence, even here in this human life. We think, oh, this is wonderful. It's not such a bad place to be. But we don't take into consideration that it's impermanent. And when this life ends, inevitably we will fall to the lower realms if we haven't really done the work that we need to do to assure that we're going to get a good existence. So again, this is all through the force of our ignorance, and once more is clinging to everything in this way. So the commentary on that, page 78, through the force of occasionally meeting with a virtuous teacher, one takes a happy rebirth from time to time for the shortest of periods, just like we've done now in this existence, like a flash of lightning in the sky. And this is, again, back in the first chapter, there was also that reference. I think it was in the 4th verse, wasn't it, where it said that this existence is like a flash of lightning in the sky. No, maybe it's a little beyond the 4th one. 5th one, just as a flash of lightning on a dark, cloudy night, I'm reading Stephen Batchelor, for an instant brightly illuminates all. Likewise in this world, through the might of Buddha, a wholesome thought rarely and briefly appears. This idea that things are so transitory, it's just like a flash of lightning. This existence that we think is, we just cling to it so much, and it's going to be over before we know it. And it says, having enjoyed much happiness there, one then has to experience the rough, hot, unpleasant sufferings in the lower realms and fall into the unceasing great hells, where one remains for infinite eons experiencing terrifying suffering. Therefore, contemplate the sufferings in the lower realms, though that will be a potential consequence if we don't do the work, the deeper work of realizing emptiness. Obviously, you can create the causes to avoid the lower rebirths through other means, practicing the 10 virtues and so on, all these things. We really should want to be free of it once and for all, but that's one of the consequences. That's one of the disadvantages to our next life. Let's go on to the next verse. There are many pitfalls in cyclic existence due to mutual contradiction also on that. Like this, without suchness in that, in cyclic existence, there is no such thusness. Again, it's not saying that thusness doesn't exist in psychic existence. It's saying that the realization of it, the awareness of it, the awareness of emptiness doesn't exist. And sentient beings have this mutual contradiction, and that they are adhering to things as inherently existent, when in fact they don't exist that way at all. Mutual contradiction is kind of a strange phrase. It means that they're sort of mutually exclusive. We are adhering to something as if it exists when it doesn't exist. And so there's a contradiction that's going on there. And because of that, we experience all these various pitfalls, all these various forms of suffering. Oh, I wanted to keep that on because I actually have some verses or some commentary from Brilliant Torch on this. Regarding the defects of existence in general, in this abode of samsara, the fruit of the abundant accumulation of negative actions is the countless abysses of the lower realms into which one tumbles. But we can say, in regard to all of psychic existence, it's any state in which we are propelled through the force of our karma and delusions. In this existence, without comprehending the ultimate means for liberation from samsara, one is bound by the noose of the mistaken belief in reality. And in such a state, the belief in the self and substantiality, which is the root of samsara, opposes or is contradicted by the wisdom, which is the realization of no self and non-substantiality, and which is the path for attaining nirvana. So we essentially have these two things that, again, that are mutually opposing or contradictory. One is what the ignorance that is adhering to things as if they exist substantially, the self and what have you as inherently, and then the wisdom, which is the realization that that doesn't exist at all. But within samsara, that wisdom doesn't exist, again, because, well, we can't say it doesn't exist at all, but we mean that it doesn't exist in terms of the causes and conditions that are furthering the state of samsara that beings are in. We continue to be propelled through the force of that belief in the self. So, therefore, in this existence, which is the condition of being bound by belief in true existence, there is no such understanding of the ultimate reality. As I was saying, there's no real understanding of emptiness can be involved in this because we get propelled from life to life through the force of our ignorance. And against one's will, one experiences unbearable sufferings, which can only be illustrated as a vast ocean, endless in space and time. So that was that last part of that verse, that it's kind of like an ocean. I actually think that's 158, this one, where it says, pass beyond the confines of the ocean of suffering, which is incomparable and unbearable also in that. And this is a commentary on that, the top of page 79. It says, therefore, if one does not comprehend suchness, then one elaborates functionalities as truly existent, and as a result, one will be in contradiction to the cause of liberation. Then there is nothing left but to circle in psychic existence, because in the world of circling, there is no such comprehension of suchness, and it is a unique existence in which one experiences an ocean of terrifying infinite suffering without example. Therefore, it is suitable to strive in understanding emptiness. Again, the wording of that is a little strange, but the idea is that sentient beings experience an ocean of suffering through the force of this ignorance. And until you introduce the wisdom of suchness into the equation and begin to undermine the ignorance that is driving them to be drawn towards those sufferings, even though they don't want to suffer, to be thwarted in getting happiness, though they have every intention of wanting happiness, the intention isn't good enough. Just simply wanting happiness and not wanting to suffer. You have to know the causes that lead to those results. And the final cause that leads to the freedom from all of circling, and then of course to enlightenment as well, is the wisdom realizing suchness or emptiness. So we have the third section then, contemplating that despite taking rebirth in the happy realm, there is no time to practice Dharma. This is very close to one of the things that we do in the death awareness meditation, where we recognize that even though we have this human existence, that the amount of time that we spend and energy we spend, and of course the laziness we have, all of these become obstacles to our real practice of the Dharma. And it says the first two lines of last two of 158, first two in this section, strength is weak in that existence. In other words, we don't usually have this force behind our actions to engage in virtue and so on, and developing wisdom. And the lifespan there is short as well. We might think our lives are fairly long, but they're really not that long. And of course, there's no guarantee that we have a nice, healthy lifespan. We might be dealing with the reality of our lives being quite short, depending upon causes and conditions again. So the few sentences on that, that first paragraph, it says, therefore, in that existence, these good existences that you do attain at times, like we have currently, although one takes rebirth in a happy realm, as a consequence, the power to create virtue is thus weak, as a consequence of everything else that preceded it, because we've been continually under the control of our karma and delusions, only creating the causes for more suffering. We get into this ideal human rebirth, but we don't have all of the strength behind our minds to use it the way that we would ideally like to. I think there was some sort of quote saying that they have in Tibet about the first 20 years you do this, and the next 20 years you do that, and then the third 20 years you do something else. You get to the last 20 years, and that's like your exit. By that time, you haven't really done anything with your life. So we might fall into the same pattern, and the desire to create virtue is weak. So it says, consequence, the power to create virtue is thus weak, and the basis for achieving virtue, the freedoms and endowments, is short-lived. We end up with very little time when it comes down to it. And we need to hear these things. I know it's hard sometimes, but we have to kind of cross that line and get into a place where we're really putting wholehearted energy into the path. In 159, it continues, there too, in these happy realms, in activities for life and freedom from sickness and hunger and fatigue and sleep and detriment, and likewise in meaningless associations with the childish, life passes by swiftly without purpose. Discrimination is very difficult to gain. How could there be a method to overcome habituation with distractions in that, in this type of realm? So even though we have this ideal rebirth, we're caught up in so many preoccupations and distractions. Look at how much time we spend just taking care of these bodies every day, feeding them and bathing them and dressing them and exercising them and whatever else, just to sustain this life, all the things we have to do. And of course, we are caught up in all of these patterns of distraction with regard to existence. And so we end up wasting a lot of our life. Here, I'll go through this rather quickly. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. These last two paragraphs on 79. Even if one stays there for the briefest of times, there's no time to practice the Dharma, and one's time passes quickly with meaningless activities. There are actions with which one hopes to stay with for a long time, such as washing and massaging the body and relying on medicine to stay free from sickness. There's thirst, fatigue on the road, sleep, and being harmed by various inner and outer harms. Likewise, through meaningless association with the childish, life passes quickly without meaning and disintegrates without the opportunity to practice Dharma due to meaningless association with the childish. By childish, we mean people who are spiritually immature, who are only, looking at the existence of this life as what they're here for, to get as much as you can, go for the gusto, all that sort of thing. People who are really preoccupied with this life, who can become very bad influences on our spiritual practice. It says, because it is extremely difficult to find opportunity to investigate the meaning of suchness, which is the cause to go beyond existence, one should strive in the method to reverse cyclic existence. So again, he's giving us this pep talk about use this life that we have to realize thusness, to do this type of work, to investigate emptiness, to meditate on it, to continue to read and study it, to receive teachings, from great masters on it and what have you. Now we look at the next outline, which is contemplating the difficulty of attaining a birth with leisure and endowment, which again, we might think, it's pretty easy to attain, don't have to worry so much, just be a good person maybe. Well, it might take a little more than that. But anyway, this is giving us this admonishment that it is quite difficult. There too, in this existence, Maras, these demons, and I'll talk about them in a moment, they strive in order that one falls into the great bad migrations. The Maras are often set out as being kind of these four demons or four demonic forces. Three of them are really inside us, so they're part of our continuum. The Mara of the afflictions, the Mara of the aggregates, and the Mara of the Lord of Death, which isn't a being, it means that we are all subject to death. So we have these aggregates that we appropriate every life. We have the afflictions that go from life to life that become problematic for us. And then we have death that even when we get into an existence like this, that is pretty rare and precious, invariably it ends and we have to part from it. So the idea that's being put forward here is that these demons or these demonic forces, the fourth one is the one that he is being referred to here. It's often called the Deva Putra, or the sons of the gods. The Deva Putra is said to be a being that comes from these sort of God realms that can influence you to have excessive attachment or pride or these various delusions. The sort of way they're described is they shoot an arrow at you, kind of like Cupid or whatever, that shoots the arrow that makes you fall in love. Well, this is a sort of force that through the force of that being who's an interferer to some degree that you have some sort of karma with. And then that through the force of that karma, you experience these waves of kind of excessive delusion that cause you to sort of go off track and get quite caught up in worldly pleasures and what have you. And they end up through the force of those things. Now, whether these are actual beings or not, and that may not be as important, through the force of these excessive amounts of delusion that we have in our minds, we end up in the unfortunate states in the hell realms. So here there's on page 70 or 80, there's an argument first. And somebody's coming forward and saying, oh, it's acceptable that I do all this with this life. Why? Because you can stop psychic existence simply through meditating on emptiness when you take rebirth in a happy realm. And then you do that. You just get into a happy realm and you meditate on emptiness and you'll be fine. Well, the answer is given in terms of these two lines. Psychic existence is extremely difficult to stop due to having habituated oneself since beginningless samsaric lives to grasping at functionalities as truly existent. Again, we've had this ignorance since beginningless time. And to the distractions such as outer excitements and the like. How can there be the method to stop it, as conducive conditions are extremely rare and harmful obstructing conditions abound? Even during this limited time to practice, the Dharma demons, such as the Son of Gods, work for one to fall into the great hells. The conditions obstructing liberation from existence are many and difficult to stop. So again, whether, this example that's being pointed out here, obviously, Gyaltsab Je gives us more to think about, just our habituation to the ignorance, to the other delusions, all of this that we have, that we come into this human life with, that you have to work so hard to overcome. You can't just say, oh, well, I'll get another human life, and then in that human life, because I've had exposure to the teachings on emptiness, I'll just realize emptiness then. You don't know what kind of conditions are going to be there in that future life. You get born into another body with another type of existence in a different environment, different influences, what have you. And then you have a whole other chain of delusions that you have to fight in order to even get to a place where you can begin to, realize emptiness or meditate on it. Whoops. The rest of that verse. At that, wrong paths are abundant. And doubt is difficult to overcome. So this is the other things that we deal with in this existence that make it difficult to be able to have that assurance that in a future life we're going to realize emptiness. Because if we do get an existence like this, there still are going to be problems. It says the argument here now for this verse, or these two lines, says, it is not difficult to find opportunity to liberate oneself from existence, because when one takes rebirth in the happy realms, then one can achieve liberation through practices such as meditating on faith for the truth, the three jewels, and the like. Again, using a similar type of argument, but saying, again, I can count on getting another existence like this one, another opportunity in a happy realm, and then I can achieve liberation there. The answer from Shantideva is, while taking rebirth in the happy realms, there are many wrong paths that have fallen into the extremes of eternalism or nihilism, which are opposing conditions to generating the right view. The view of the middle way, the view of emptiness, is that perfect middle way between these two extremes, not falling into the extreme of annihilation, nihilism, not falling into the extreme of a sort of eternalism or permanence. So do we have a guarantee that we're going to encounter that middle way again, that we're not going to be confused by wrong paths that are set out by other spiritual guides and what have you? And it says there are false teachers that lead one on these paths, and it is difficult to contradict doubt with regard to the correct paths, because it is difficult to find the inner and outer conditions to cut that doubt. And it takes a lot to cut this doubt and to realize emptiness. So I think, these sort of we're just going to kick the can down the road sort of thing. We're going to get another human rebirth there, and we'll become enlightened or liberated in that lifetime. Well, and there's no guarantee that you're going to have all these perfect conditions. Because once more, we're not just talking about a human existence. We're talking about a perfect human rebirth, which means that everything's fallen into place. We have contact with the Buddha, with his teachings, with people who are followers of those teachings, practicing them, and so on. All of those conditions to come together, we've got them in this life. We shouldn't kick the can down the road. We should do what we need to do right now. Leisure is hard to gain again. The occurrence of a Buddha is extremely rare. If that's part of this idea of having this perfect life with the 8 leisures and the 10 endowments, well, even being born into a realm in a time when there's a Buddha that exists in that realm or has existed, that the teachings are still, existing from that Buddha, this is also hard. So here we get another argument, the third argument on this page. Although one may not find a virtuous teacher in this life, it is acceptable because one will find one in the next life and then practice. Again, another point of sort of saying, well, we'll get that in the next life, or we'll get it in our future human existence when we have a happy rebirth again. The answer, well, if one does not strive well in this life, when one has found a virtuous teacher, then it will be difficult to find freedom again in the future. And since it is extremely rare for a Buddha to come to the world, it is very hard to meet with a virtuous teacher. They say we're living in the eon of 1,000 Buddhas, a very fortunate eon in existence. But that's not like 1,000 Buddhas showing up every, 100 years or something. You get a new one. We had Buddha Shakyamuni over 2,500 years ago appear in this world. We don't have another Buddha on the horizon till Maitreya Buddha. And I think Jeffrey Hopkins in Meditation on Emptiness, he says it's way out there. I mean, it's not like, a couple hundred years down the road or something. These things don't happen that frequently, that often. For us to kind of use this thinking that somehow we're going to meet with the Buddha's teachings again in some future existence, when right now we've already met with them, it's kind of, not really the right thinking. Then we have finally the last two lines of this section, verse 162 CD. The river of afflictions will be difficult to abandon. Alas, suffering flows. Yeah, maybe that should be our bumper sticker. Alas, suffering flows. We're dealing with the reality of suffering that is going to be propelled by the river of afflictions. And if we don't do something now, it's just going to keep happening. They say insanity is, that would be a different definition. Insanity is not doing something to change things, even though you know that you could, rather than doing the same thing over and over again and it not working. But anyway, the idea here is that we definitely have to take advantage of what we have right now. So this is the last paragraph into the top of the next page. Although one has met a virtuous teacher and already attained a wholesome basis with freedoms and endowments, if one does not strive well in conscientiousness, then it is hard to counter the river of afflictions. They will continue to pour down until one has attained liberation. Alas, the suffering flows. It contains the meaning of sadness and despondency because one continually experiences one suffering after the next, as well as experiencing extreme suffering. Although one may be free from one suffering, one falls into another suffering. And within the realm of samsara, they're all suffering. They're all unsatisfactory. Dukkha pervades. Suffering flows. It's everywhere. Therefore, one should strive in contemplating the sufferings of psychic existence while having attained freedom and endowments. And even more than that, contemplated the solution to all of that, the wisdom realizing emptiness that will cut the root of suffering. Final section in this, where are we at time-wise? I think we can at least get into this section. Maybe we'll finish it. This is the final section, page 81, that oneself and others are afflicted by the suffering of psychic existence is suitable to be mourned. This is suitable to really just have great sadness about, that we're all in this state, ourselves and others. These abiding in the river of suffering, who, although suffering immensely in that way, do not see their own suffering. Alas, they are pitiful. Maybe we don't even see our own suffering yet. Again, we have to, as was said by Gyaltsab, we have to reflect on the sufferings of psychic existence, get that this human life is suffering, that every moment of existence is suffering. This is pitiful. This is sad that sentient beings continue to not even be aware of the fact that they're suffering. The first paragraph there, sentient beings suffer to the extreme. They do not see that they are sinking in suffering by mistaking suffering for happiness. What is actually in the nature of suffering? Samsaric pleasures and so on. They think that that is happiness. But as we know, that's only the suffering of change. It's not capable of ultimately satisfying. And they are submerged in a river of suffering. Having generated love for these sentient beings that sink in the mud of suffering, they are suitable to be mourned with the thoughts of, oh dear, how wonderful would it be if sentient beings were free from suffering and the like. Therefore, one needs to strive in meditating on great compassion. That I was mentioning these three types of compassion earlier, but even when we see that sentient beings don't even get the extent that they are suffering, we can generate compassion for them on the basis of seeing the way that they are suffering. But that too could be another way we could, work with our compassion, is understanding that most beings live in ignorance of that. And as I said earlier, maybe we ourselves are still somewhat in ignorance of that. We all have to do our own investigation. Are we still buying into samsara as, oh, maybe it's not that bad. Human existence, not so bad. Well, no, it is bad. Take it from Shantideva, from the Buddhas, from everybody. It's as bad as you think it is, or as it seems to be, if you do the deeper investigation. So great compassion is the only response that makes sense in regard to seeing beings caught up in this pattern of being driven by their own ignorance to experience suffering upon suffering and not even being aware that they're suffering. It is like one who repeatedly washes himself and then enters fire again and again. They're talking here about people who engage in various forms of ablution and torturing themselves through fire and what have you. These means that are put forward as a way of attaining liberation that actually don't cause liberation at all. So they pride themselves in being happy, although they abide in immense suffering. Sentient beings are very confused about things. People go about trying to do all the craziest things to attain some happiness. And when we look at them, it breaks our heart, because all they do is create more suffering. This middle paragraph there, for examples, some followers of outside tenets that were deceived by misleading teachers repeatedly wash themselves and then enter the fire again and again. Although they abide with strong suffering due to the physical austerity, they project happiness onto it by holding it to be a method for attaining liberation. So they're convinced that this is the means to happiness. So that keeps them from, having the sort of pain behind it. They're happy that they are moving in the direction of liberation, but they're totally confused. They're going about trying to attain liberation through something that is not the means for getting that result at all. These other techniques that are taught by various other spiritual traditions, tenet systems, what have you. Again, I don't know who's being specifically referred to there, but final verse of this 165. Those abiding in that way, behaving as though there is no aging and death. First they are killed, and then they proceed to the unbearable, falling into the bad migrations. Again, another reflection that can break our hearts, because we see that they're going about life as if there is no aging and death, as if these things don't exist. And they invariably have to die and fall to a lower realm. And this is a sad situation. Last few lines on page 81. Thus, those that abide acting like arhats without death or sickness. Of course, an arhat has freed themselves from all of that suffering, right? Because they've abandoned all the causes of suffering, which are the afflictive obscurations. They haven't yet abandoned the knowledge obscurations, but they've liberated themselves from suffering, from dukkha. So they won't have aging and death, but sentient beings are behaving as if aging and death didn't exist for them, but they're not arhats. They haven't attained that freedom. So they think that they're free from suffering and death, but it's all in their own imagination, thinking that, aging and death and what have you don't exist. Well, no, they do exist, and we're all subject to them. We live our lives thinking that these things are not going to happen to us. I remember Venerable Rabina once, when we were on a retreat with her, and one of our community members passed away. And I told her about that this woman had died, and Venerable Rabina says, "Oh, all I can think is someday that's going to be me. Someday it's going to be them saying, oh, Venerable Rabina died, or oh, Don died, or whatever." We have to keep thinking that way, that is going to happen. Someday you're going to be the obituary. You can look at the obituaries every day and think, oh, all those people, no, maybe some of them were around my age, and some were a lot younger, some of them were way older, but someday that's going to be you, your little picture, your little life story, where your body's going to be if they want to go view it or whatever, all that kind of stuff. We have to keep reminding ourselves and not be like these beings who are blind to that reality. So then it says, they are first killed by the Lord of Death without any means to stop or abandon him. And then come the terrifying sufferings of having fallen into the three lower realms. the preponderance of beings who die from existence, wherever they're at, fall into lower realms. Even those in lower realms tend to fall into lower realms, and those in higher realms tend to fall into lower realms. I think it was the Buddha, there's the story of he was at the banks of the river Ganges, and he said, these are all the beings, and he picked up on like a handful of sand or something and said, these are all that were born in an upper rebirth. And then he took his fingernail and took a few grains of sand and said, these are all those that'll be reborn into another higher state, that were in the high states of existence to begin with. That we have this delusion that somehow there's a guarantee that we're going to keep on this path. But have we done what needs to be done? And of course, when we get to the deeper error that's involved in all this, that sentient beings are clinging to inherent existence, and that's the root of all their problems, why they keep being propelled from life to life, upper rebirths, lower rebirths, everything in between, All right, so I think that's enough for tonight. And next week, again, we're going to finish off chapter 9. There's just these wonderful two verses that continue with the idea of great compassion and generating that mind. Some closing verses for chapter 9. And then I'll talk a little bit about 10. We'll go into just a couple of bits of commentary on it, but mostly what we're going to do is read chapter 10 as a way of dedicating all the positive potential from our study of this text. But yeah, there are a few little bits that are worth saying, but most of the dedication verses are really pretty straightforward. So I don't know that we'll need to do much commentary on that. Any questions from tonight? Any concerns or things anyone wanted to share? Yeah, stay.
Actually, again, Dawn, I misspoke. We had 3 burning questions from our discussion.
So you have another one for me.
So
okay.
We have another one. So this was when we were discussing the diamond splinters reasoning, and we were going through the 4 options. And we wanted to clarify between the second and the 4th slivers in terms of their absurd consequences. So the second one says, if you have 2, if the cause and effect are unrelated, then you can get like vases from pillars. And then the 4th one says, for causeless production, you can then also get flowers in the sky. So it seems like you end up in the same place with both of them. So what is the real difference between 2 and 4?
Well, but I think they are a little bit different in that when we say that existence, for the second one, when we say something that again is the production from other, right, from an inherently existent other. So if things were produced from something that is inherently existent other, then you have this pot that is inherently existent pot and a pillar that's an inherently existent pillar. So we could say that this could become the cause for that, because everything is inherently existent other. There's no relationship. There's no causal relationship that is established in regard to this being the cause for that. So while we normally would assume that this particular seed is a cause for this particular sprout, the sprout could arise from anything, because everything is in the same category of being an inherently existent other. With the last one, I think, again, and the consequence of a sky flower is really the realm of non-existence. That things could arise from nowhere. They don't have any cause whatsoever. So I think they're saying 2 different things. And the one they're saying something that is unrelated could be the cause for it. And the other one, things would have no cause. They just arise from space, You'd have a sky flower, you'd have, whatever, all these various things appearing from nowhere. So I think they are different in that causeless production would mean that things would appear without anything we could point to, whereas production from an inherently existent other means that anything could become the cause for that. Does that make some sense? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions from tonight or previous classes? Just don't ask me something that goes way back to like the beginning of chapter 9. Not sure I've got the ability to go back there and answer that, but okay. So again, I'm looking forward to next week in some ways because it's wonderful to be at the conclusion of this, but in other ways it's kind of sad. And we'll be coming to the end of our studies together on this amazing text. But let's do some dedication prayers now. And of course, next week we do sort of big dedication. But tonight we'll do the usual verses that we've been doing, these two prayers. You get that on the screen. The first one that is all about making sure that the merit we've created brings about the greatest possible result through our own attainment of enlightenment, and then our ability to lead others to achieving that same state. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. And then this wonderful verse that is really the essence of this entire work of Shantideva's, that we're talking initially in these chapters about growing bodhicitta, developing it where it hasn't arisen. And wherever it has arisen, may we make sure that it doesn't decrease by virtue of our anger and so on. And instead, may it become even more and more powerful, this amazing mind of bodhicitta, especially when we unite it with the concentration and wisdom in these last few chapters. So let's recite this verse with that sincere wish that this happen for ourselves as well as for all sentient beings. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And then our precious teachers saying prayers for their good health, long lives, for their wishes to be fulfilled. As we recite these two verses, think that by extension, we're including all beings who are in that role of spiritual guide, so that they too have the same results, and that we and others are never parted from perfect guides in all our lifetimes. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world. To the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers, honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And let's dedicate, as we usually do, for all those beings who we know or have heard of, whose situation moves us at this time, whether they're experiencing obstacles or illness, are dying, or perhaps we know those who have died recently. We send this energy out to them so they can be free of all of their suffering immediately, and also find all the causes that will lead them to perfect peace and happiness. And may these results also come to be for all sentient beings. Wonderful. Thank you all so much. I'll look forward to seeing you next week.